Okay. Hello, everyone. During this ACBS Poland featuring Australia event on psychosis, and today we are hosting Eric Morris. I know him most directly on his work with the shape supervision model, and here he'll be presenting his expertise regarding group acceptance and commitment therapy for psychosis recovery. He's an associate professor at Trobe University and a clinical psychologist at Norton Health in Melbourne. And he has over 30 years of experience in Australia, in UK, and focuses on helping people with complex mental health issues. So, hello, Eric. Glad to have you on board. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, I very much appreciate the kind invitation, Bartosz. It's excellent to see you, and it's excellent to connect with everyone here who uh, is either here live or watches this lecture. And yeah, as you describe, I have spent just about all my career working with people who've experienced serious mental illness and uh, and worked in public mental health services. So a lot of what I'm going to describe today is work that we have developed in public mental health services that started, 18 years ago, with a conversation in a cafe about, should we try doing a group to try and reach young people with psychosis and sort of understand how we might do acceptance commitment therapy with them. So I'll try and give you a flavor of what group ACT looks like in the services that I work in now. Just a little piece. I am based in Melbourne, Australia, and um, this part of Australia is part of the Wurundjeri lands of the people of the Kulin Nation. So these are the traditional custodians of the land, and I want to acknowledge that the traditional owners of the land never gave the land up. The land was never ceded. It was taken by the government of the time, and Australians now acknowledge that the effects of colonialism and that the traditional owners of the land continue to have a connection to their land. And I'm very grateful to be presenting to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Some of what I'm going to talk about tonight involves a group manual. This group manual it outlines a 7 session ACT group for people with psychosis. It's freely available, so this QR code or this link will get you to a folder where there's the manual in English. You are very welcome to use the treatment manual in any way you see fit. If it helps people where you are, that is terrific. And that's a big part of the work we've done is we've done it in government, public services. We've given it away. We've found lots of friends and collaborators together to develop this work. And so, if there's something that's useful here for you, please use it in any way that works for you and the people that you help. So, this morning, I guess I want to give a sense of trying to briefly describe ACT for psychosis and personal recovery and show how building psychological flexibility allows people with psychosis to develop a new relationship with their experiences, both unusual experiences, but also experiences to do with their self, to do with their values, to do with personal recovery. And I know that you've heard from Professor Brandon Gordiano about this, so I'm going to assume some knowledge about ACT and really get into why we sort of think a group-based approach is a good idea here. So I'm going to try and give you a sense in the time I have of what these groups look like and some of the adaptations that we've made to typical ACT to engage people with psychosis. I guess to set the scene is, although I'll use the word psychosis as the broad term for the kinds of experiences and challenges that people may have, it's important to consider that many of the people we work with would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is increasing in prevalence and incidence and disease burden um, since 1990. So people with schizophrenia have a life expectancy 12 to 15 years less than the general population. They're a group of people that can be marginalized, discriminated against, and can receive poor health care. Um, they're also a group of people that are at increased risk of dying by suicide, but also by all sorts of forms of neglect and ill health. So I personally think it's an important piece of justice and equity to see if psychological approaches can be part of the picture in supporting people with psychosis. It also is that when we observe worldwide about people's recovery from psychosis, and during the 30 years that I've worked, there's been a paradigm of early intervention for psychosis, of trying to engage young people who might show uh, the early signs of developing a psychotic disorder, of developing services to support them in their recovery. And the evidence suggests that actually people having a full recovery from a first episode of psychosis, that's actually improving, that's increasing. But what might have happened, particularly in many highly developed countries, is that the resourcing for mental health services for people who've had multiple episodes or longer, histories of psychosis has, well, the funding is not followed through. And so these services are perhaps underfunded. And in fact, what we're seeing is that the incidence of people having multiple episodes and becoming more disabled from multiple episodes is actually increasing. There is a need for, in our societies, to find ways of properly supporting people with psychosis to live full, rich lives with inclusive services. So this is sort of part of the background of the work I do. So while we develop these groups in an early intervention for psychosis service, now these days I evaluate and run these groups in services for people who have persisting psychotic symptoms or frequent episodes, the group of people that have been perhaps underserved in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. One thing we sort of know now is that um, mental health services should not be primarily focused on reducing symptoms. We know with psychosis that while medications may help people to um, have fewer psychotic symptoms and possibly stay well, that is certainly not the end of the story. And in fact, many people who are needing to take those medications over long term find that a hard task. Um, and if services are only focused on reducing psychotic symptoms, then there is a whole piece missing here about people's identity, about their emotions, about their social connections, and meaning. And so we've argued in various places, including in this book, that we need to do better and that we need a paradigm shift. The services shouldn't just be focused on treating psychosis in a clinical way, but in a holistic way. And this isn't just a set of ideas that a bunch of academics or dreaming clinicians hope for. This is actually what people with schizophrenia and psychosis ask for. On this list here, which comes from a study that Daniel Freeman and colleagues did in Oxford in the United Kingdom, where, shock horror, they actually asked people with schizophrenia what they wanted from mental health services. Well, on this list are a bunch of treatment targets, if you want to put it that way, or things that people would like you to focus on. And on this list are things like feeling happier, worrying less, having increased self-confidence, feeling like you're making better decisions, feeling safer. Now, I got to tell you, I would like a number of these things too. These are not surprising, goals that people would want to have. And we already have evidence-based technologies to support people with psychosis with these. It might be a matter of how we think about supporting people with psychosis that's important, right? So there's a piece here about a need for research, and I'm an academic, I would say that, in psychological therapies for psychosis that focus on a range of processes that might maintain people's distress and disability, but support the creation of therapeutic contexts for people. Um, so, real relationships, real connections, um, uh, connections with people that take your emotions and your thoughts seriously, that are interested in your personal well-being and your recovery, of doing research where we meet people where they are. So doing this in real life settings. And I'd argue that a fair bit of the ACT for psychosis research that we see is of this kind. The way we think about ACT for psychosis is similar to how many people think about ACT. In our settings, we don't really use the hexaflex as a way of guiding our behavior as therapists. We think more in terms of three pillars. So open, aware, and active. That's how we orientate our way to engaging people with psychosis is along these three pillars. Um, and that is also useful because a lot of our work in our groups is not done by experts in ACT. It is done by healthcare workers who might have just a bit of ACT training. It may also be done by peers, so experts by experience, people who have recovered from serious mental health problems who are now facilitators of groups and can talk from their own personal space of recovery. And so finding less technical language and more everyday language for the processes that we're trying to strengthen is really useful. I guess just a bit of an orientation about ACT for psychosis. ACT for psychosis now is over, maybe my guess would be over 25 years old. Um, the first ACT studies were done, the published studies were done in US psychiatric hospitals as very brief therapies with, you know, surprising findings. ACT can be done as a brief therapy supporting people with psychosis. It's a pragmatic, process-driven approach, and it shows promising outcomes. In this paper that I wrote with Louise Johns and Brandy Gordiano, we identified that there it needs to be a shift, though, towards more precision models, perhaps models that focus not on psychosis per se, but say on paranoia or on voice hearing or on personal recovery in particular. Um, there's a need for more studies that are looking at implementation, real life studies in services, and whether we can measure the processes of change and the outcomes there. And a need for low intensity and blended, digital interventions. There's never going to be enough ACT therapists to reach all of the people that may benefit from ACT. It's also useful to consider that ACT is part of a picture of um, interventions that might support recovery, personal recovery. Um, but, it's not the only answer. And in fact, for some people, it may not be useful for them at all. Um, we're yet to discover who benefits most from ACT and how to link ACT more closely with personal recovery. we've said that, well, ACT for psychosis or ACT-P, there's a CBT-P, why not have ACT-P? That it really is about developing a flexible approach to responding to both the symptoms of psychosis, but also associated thoughts and emotions um, to increase values-based behavior. So it's the same as ACT with all sorts of other experiences and challenges. It's about the values. It's about acting on your values. And I think that would be a point of discrimination between perhaps some of the other psychological approaches to psychosis I'm familiar with, where in ACT, it's very clearly about your personal recovery, your own chosen life directions. That's what sort of defines and helps you to assess ACT as an intervention. ACT for psychosis, I think it's a good fit because really we're interested in the impact of symptoms and experiences rather than their presence. You know, in the 30 years I've worked, we now know that many people in the general community have unusual experiences without necessarily being distressed or highly impacted by those experiences. We know that up to 1 in 10 people will hear a voice in their lifetime. We know that many people can experience paranoid thinking. Perhaps in the age we're in, many more of us do than before under the stresses and strains of the political situations and social situations that we're faced with. So we actually have, say, in the 30 years I've worked, a much more psychological view of the impacts of these experiences being important. And certain contexts actually intensify these impacts. And there is good evidence now to show that experiential avoidance is linked with certain psychotic symptoms, such as paranoia and hearing voices, and similarly with cognitive fusion. In fact, cognitive fusion seems to be one of, in the psychological flexibility model, one of the strongest predictors of paranoid thinking. And so, if you think that ACT for psychosis is about trying to work on the impact of these experiences upon someone, we don't assume these experiences need to be gone for people to live lives that matter. We don't assume that people want these experiences to be gone. If you hear a voice that actually at sometimes is comforting, provides you social knowledge you don't otherwise have, perhaps you don't want to get rid of that experience. Perhaps that experience has important meaning for you. Well, the ACT model allows us to work, I think, in a respectful, skillful way with this. So we have sort of said that, well, perhaps ACT for psychosis has a bit of a style that might be different from other forms of ACT. I mean, it's still ACT. I'm just saying there's a slight difference here. So if I talk in generalities, then one thing is that the type of ACT we do is gentle and predictable and conversational. One thing is that we don't do ACT that is mysterious or doesn't allow people to say, oh, I'd rather not do this. We are seeking consent all the time as we go without, reinforcing being avoidant and frightened of things. But everything that we do, we may describe, oh, we're going to do this exercise now. It's going to involve this. It's going to take this long, etc., and see whether people will opt in to do it. The type of mindfulness that we do is more talky. It's kind of like the pace of my voice today, right? Very few pauses in the mindfulness that we do. When working with individuals, you might discover that you can do more traditional mindfulness, but usually we start with fairly talky and flexible forms of mindfulness. Maybe not with your eyes closed, maybe not sitting down somewhere, maybe it's walking, doing an activity, whatever, because it's not really about the form of the mindfulness. So, like other forms of ACT, it's about the function of it. And that's important here too. We think that it's useful to reduce maybe the number of metaphors that you use when you're engaging people with psychosis and maybe using a central metaphor, creating like a scaffold or a way of connecting everything to that metaphor And so in our groups, we use the passengers on the bus metaphor, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Um, but reducing the metaphors, maybe repeating and that metaphor that you do use, using lots of examples of other people, um, using self-disclosure from yourself, and linking it to the metaphor seems important. Um, and uh, keeping these sort of principles in mind. Appreciation of the whole person. So, people with psychosis can be a population that is discriminated against and marginalized and invalidated. They can be, and in mental health services, talked about as collections of symptoms, as collections of problems. The person can sort of disappear with the worries about risk or the clinical picture or whatever storytelling that we do in teams. And so, what can be lost also is you're engaging with a whole person who has qualities um, that you may find that you can appreciate. You know, let's look for those qualities for this whole person to treat someone in a holistic way and to find connection with the shared experience of being a human being. Now, this is a big part of, all sorts of successful groups, whether they're ACT or not, is finding common humanity. Um, and we really go for this because there's some good evidence to suggest that people with psychosis can many times feel disconnected and alienated from other people. Um, maybe for some people, because of the lack of social inclusion, they may have actually very few people in their lives that they actually share things intimately with. Um, and I don't know about you, but when I've had periods of isolation, perhaps even periods where I've been ostracized, then I have developed some very peculiar ideas about myself and other people. And there seems to be some good evidence for this that people who aren't very socially included can develop more conspiracist and paranoid type ideas. It's certainly loneliness is a very hard thing to live with. And so I think stylistically in Act for Psychosis, you are very deliberately trying to find all those ways of showing a shared connection of being a human being together. Another piece stylistically, and this helps to decode what we do in our groups, is the idea of addition. This is an old ACT idea, addition rather than subtraction, but I think it's very important when you're working with people with psychosis that what we're doing in our groups is we're inviting people to add some more coping strategies to their toolkit, not to be rehabilitated, not to be fixed. We're not ever giving anyone a sense that they're doing things wrong because a lot of the people we work with are super survivors and actually highly skilled. Whatever it takes to come to our groups, if you're hearing a voice screaming at you, or you're really paranoid, or you're very shy, and you still come and see us in a group, wow, that's incredible that you managed to do that. So we're very respectfully uh, offering willingness and acceptance, if you haven't tried that much before, as additions. And you can see whether or not they work for you. So that's the other bit. The pragmatic truth criterion in an act goes, well, let's actually see whether this story we're telling about these coping strategies actually leads to anything useful for you. You can judge that in terms of your own life. And so very much our groups are about this too, respectfully introducing some ideas and then seeing what people make of them. And finally, the idea of construction, constructing a life worth living today. Again, this is important because some of the people we work with have strongly got the sense that they will only have a life worth living if they stop hearing voices or they're no longer paranoid or they don't have any more episodes of psychosis. And unfortunately, that's looking unlikely, right? They may have even got messages from health professionals that they can't really have a life worth living because they've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, right? And we want to present instead the idea that building a life worth living starts right now. It can start in this moment of constructing something for the sake of it. So this is a very values-driven type way of looking at things. Um, then waiting for some time when life could be worth living. Let's find some ways of having life worth living now. So that's a function of the values work. I think in doing Act for Psychosis and please forgive me for all the mm, yes, American type heroes here, but we are looking for a style of highlighting people's coping strategies and strengths, of doing a lot of validation of what people have been through, of emphasizing their courage and resilience, and normalizing responses. I've got these pictures of, potentially heroic or supportive figures here because we encourage the facilitators in our groups to try and find a way of tapping into this version of them. The patient listener, but the person who is fundamentally hopeful, maybe has qualities, I mean, like Ellen Ripley from the Alien movies, like a toughness, a nurturing toughness to you here, that you're not letting go of people, right? And that even if you find it hard to understand some of the experiences they have, you know, based on your own humanity, what it's like to feel scared or ashamed or to be worried about other people's intentions, to draw upon that. And I think it's important to say that we're not doing any of this. We're not trying to do things quickly. So you'll see the groups in just a sec when I describe them have this sort of repetitive quality to them because that's a way of building up rapport and safety. We don't challenge people. So there isn't anything here where we're telling people that they're wrong with their delusional beliefs or that they don't hear a voice or these are all just psychotic symptoms or whatever. We're not really doing any of that. We're not trying to convince people or argue with them. And we're really trying not to have contexts where it seems like you are so different from me. I don't want to suggest that someone who might have experienced a lot of trauma as a child, who's heard voices for a long time or been paranoid for a long time or had grandiose delusions, that my life is exactly the same as theirs. I don't want to um, insult people with that idea that we're the same in that way. Um, but I, more importantly, am looking for their strengths and looking for what matters to them, and then how might we harness that within a group. So, all of that is sort of the background for the style of how we do these groups. You know, why do ACT in groups? Well, many ACT metaphors are interactive and actually they benefit from more than one person actually engaging with it. And so our central metaphor, the passengers in the bus, really comes alive when multiple people are actually engaged in this. It's actually often easier to notice others caught up, getting hooked, not being in the present moment before you notice yourself, right? So the modeling of other people really helps. Observing others being present and trying to be willing can actually promote these processes in yourself. And so a lot of learning is social in the groups. Making commitments to your committed actions in a group might mean you actually do things. I mean, in essence, what we're doing in Act for Psychosis groups is creating little communities where we're sharing similar stories, same language, and we're all finding ways of those moments during the week where we might act on our values. And the other bit is about reducing stigma and increasing self compassion, discovering you're not the only one, you're not alone, um, that you may nurture and care for others, and you may in time be open to being cared for and receiving compassion yourself as well. So, with our group program, we developed it in Brixton in South London in the United Kingdom. And we continue, now I live in Melbourne, to advertise these groups in the community as workshops to support personal recovery. And personal recovery is whatever you want it to be, but a life worth living. And the groups are designed to reach those people who would not necessarily try individual psychological therapy. So the idea is to come to an ACT group, sort of like to try before you buy. You can see what this whole therapy thing is like without fully getting involved in it. Um, and it seems like the ACT model allows us to reach people who aren't are from minority groups, because we're not pushing for any particular way of being a person. We're not saying that recovery looks like something that, say a white secular male person might think is important, right? And that is something we discovered through doing this. Over time, we initially ran these groups with a couple of psychologists running it. But over time, and particularly here in the services in Melbourne, these groups are co-led with peer facilitators. So with people who have lived experience of psychosis in particular roles in our services, who may be non-professionals, not necessarily trained psychologists or social workers, but have their expertise by experience. And that's powerful and important. We described in general how the principles of these groups, so a lot of the things that I just went through, we have in this ACT in Practice paper, which is freely available in the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science. We then evaluated these groups in the ACT for Life study. So we looked at the feasibility and acceptability of these groups, and we found that people with psychosis did enjoy coming to the groups. They certainly had feedback for us about how to improve the groups. This study was of a 4-session version of these groups. So really meeting people once a week for a month for a 2-hour session each time. And it seemed like following these groups, people's well-being and quality of life improved. We then got further funding. So this is all still in London for a larger study called the ACT for Recovery study that focused on well-being and functioning and directly involved peer group facilitators. This study looked at the needs of both mental health service users, so people with psychosis, and caregivers. So we ran basically the same groups, but groups for people with psychosis and groups for caregivers of people with psychosis. And with only really one change in the manual, which is around one metaphor to do with caring. Um, and we found that the groups did improve well-being for both people with psychosis and caregivers. An uncontrolled part of this study was that we followed people with psychosis. We followed up for 5 years following these groups. And we found that people who had completed the ACT groups actually had a change in their service use. So less crisis-driven contacts, fewer hospitalizations following ACT for up to 5 years after this. Now, that wasn't a control piece of the study, so it was a sort of interesting finding. And we now know from other studies of psychological interventions of psychosis that this is something that can happen, is that people functioning improves, their ability to actually self-manage their challenges improves, so that perhaps they are less reliant on services, but they also have less crises. And this is an important piece that we want to continue to research. And so from the ACT for Recovery study, we were lucky enough to be in touch with Steve Hayes, who put us in touch with New Harbinger, the US publisher, about publishing a manual based on the work that we've done. And so this book outlines the basically the way to run these groups. It also has some chapters in it about how you train others to do these groups and supervise them to do these groups, adaptations of these groups for inpatient settings as well. And the form of the group there is 6 sessions, each having the whole model, the open and aware and active model in each session. So some sort of noticing exercises, that's our version of mindfulness, um, something to do with valuing, some activity to do with the central metaphor, and always finishing with committed action work. And the committed action work in our groups is not just for the participants. The facilitators also state committed actions in the group and talk about those committed actions in the next session. So my family know when I'm running one of these groups because they tell me I become a much nicer person. Um, because I've made these committed actions, and so now I have to come back to group and actually say whether or not I've done this. And the participants in the group will ask you if you're a facilitator whether you've done what you said you were going to do. It's not just to help me have a better life. I also talk about what I might struggle with, within a sort of degree of boundaries around this, but I make more visible as a facilitator that I at times can struggle too, what my passengers on my bus are, what my thoughts, feelings, and emotions are that I struggle with. And so you can see that idea of that shared connection of being a human being as sort of part of this. Well, this group protocol has been evaluated in 2 studies, and then also in several effectiveness studies in various parts of the world. Um, and so the basic group format we know so far has been, successfully adapted to 6 or 7 regions and language groups, and adjusted for, various cultures. And it seems like people do find the group acceptable, and their well-being improves following it. So, yeah, if you're into getting a published book, it's available there. But the thing is that the manual that this book's based on is freely available for anyone, and the latest version of it we've got up on open source website for people to get a hold of. These groups have been translated into Spanish and Korean, as far as we know. That's the other 2 places where this manual has been translated into published book form. Um, but we have heard from various people in various other countries that have tried out the group. So where we first developed the groups was around Brixton and Streatham in London. Then, when I moved to Australia over 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to work with people in public mental health about adapting the groups to an Australian mental health service context. And that is this version of the manual that I was saying is freely available. And so these days, we have a 7 session group. We've sort of reduced the length of the sessions to 90 minutes. Um, and the last 10 years, we've been evaluating these groups in various ways in public mental health settings. And so let's see. Yep, jump ahead. So we have a paper published last year showing an evaluation of these groups in services in Melbourne. And we found in this study that the groups are feasible, they're acceptable, and they're safe. Um, so people do benefit, people do come to your group. It is possible to run these groups in um, uh, mental health services in Australia, which are not well funded. Um, I can tell you we don't have a fancy group room where we do this. It's some terrible little broom closet somewhere that we do all this stuff. I mean, mental health in Australia is probably as glamorous as it is in Poland. The groups don't require a lot of resources to run, but it seems like if you have keen facilitators and you can support them, um, and you start running these groups, then our experience has been that it builds enthusiasm for people to come and to try it out. And our findings suggest that Recovery Act can improve personal recovery, well-being, and psychological flexibility. We're now, we're in the last 6 months of recruiting for a much larger scale study, which is across 6 health services in Melbourne, in Australia, um, evaluating the groups. And so we hope next year that we'll be able to share the findings of that evaluation. In our group protocol, all the sessions have a similar format. There's some sort of warm up exercise. We do some sort of noticing exercise, whether it's moving around or holding an object or um, progressively in time in the group, sitting down and quietly noticing experiences on the inside. We do some discussion about your varied actions between sessions. We do a passengers in the bus activity. So we might tell the story of the passengers in the bus. We might act it out. We might show a video to it. We certainly refer to it. If there's anything that people learn from our groups, it's the passengers on the bus metaphor. So we know when we followed people up 2 or 3 years down the track, what do you remember about these groups? Then the thing that everyone remembers, oh, something about a bus. You guys were going on about passengers on the bus because we repeat it so much. And that's an important sort of adaptation, I guess, is the form of act we're doing has a heap of repetition in it. It's sort of more concrete. It allows for the fact that people may not get metaphors the first, second, third, or fifth time. That's okay. We want to wrap around this a positive social experience because even if you don't feel like you're quite getting it yet, there's some other good things that are going on. We also do a lot of small group activities. So when it comes to setting committed actions, we actually break the group into, so we usually have 2 or 3 facilitators for maybe up to 9 people. And so we work in twos or threes, really paying some attention to people to help them sort of link the noticing exercises with varied actions. Um, and we also call people out of sessions. So it isn't that people just come to group and have nothing. We actually do some coaching outside of sessions during the week. And so when you join one of our groups, um, it is about trying to find ways to have a richer, fuller life. And we are trying to signal to you we are interested in the ways that you might do this, including calling you, being in touch with you about what you've tried to do and what you're noticing and experiencing doing that. So it's all about being open, aware, and active. We use words like willingness and making space, being with. We very rarely use the M word in English, mindfulness. We don't actually describe it like that. It's all noticing and willingness. Um, it's about slowing down and being present, just like all sorts of act is, but also taking steps towards doing what matters. And they might be the smallest steps, and that's okay, you know. Um, if I go to the values piece, yeah. I mean, it's a pretty big question for anyone to ask. What do you want your life to be about? We understand and we reflect in the groups that how do you answer that question? And so we do the typical things that you can imagine. We do values cards. We actually tell lots of stories about how people might act on their values, values that you see other, um, participants showing. We're totally prepared for people to not know or struggle with identifying values. Many of the people we work with have just been surviving. Perhaps their experiences of psychosis happened at a time in their life where they were really still working out who they were going to be. Maybe it disrupted their school or their work life or their relationships, so that it might be hard to actually say what life's about. It might be painful to say what I care about. And so we take it slow, while also just continuing to talk about what could we do in this moment that could make life, worth living. We also simplify the values work by making it, say, about work or love or play or spirituality, but not having sort of giant values worksheets with 10 areas of your life, just choosing one or two that you might work on. We also might talk about who your heroes are, people you admire as examples of qualities of values. So, up on the screen, there are some people that I admire, and you might recognize some of them, and you won't recognize, and there's other ones you won't recognize, but they're all well-known people, at least to me, whose stories show qualities that I would like to show. And so we have worksheets that simplify the values work, um, and it all sort of links into the central metaphor of the passengers in the bus and the idea that you being the driver of your bus of life and your thoughts, emotions, voices, um, other experiences being passengers on the bus, and us exploring various ways that we respond to our passengers. So typically, we're doing the classic thing of noticing when your bus gets hijacked, um, when you're mindlessly following whatever comes to mind, you're reacting, but also the times when you struggle with your experiences. And we illustrate this metaphor in an animation. Now, I'm not sure whether this animation's been, this is animation that Joe Oliver and people developed years ago. I'm not sure whether it's been translated into Polish. That'll be, it hasn't yet? Okay. Um, that'll be some homework for someone. But yeah, we show this animation. We also show the story of a guy called Paul. And so we have a script for this. And Paul is describing in a video having a paranoid episode and struggling in his relationships and his working life with suspicious thinking. And we ask our participants in the group to sort of, take some guesses about what might be some passengers on Paul's bus and how he responds to his passengers and what we think might be important to Paul. So the story of another person first. Um, and it's kind of fun to show this video to people with psychosis and then to show it to health professionals and see who can answer this a lot better. I can tell you it's the people with psychosis who can answer these questions a lot better. Um, but, we actually use this then as a platform in our groups to uh, act out the metaphor of Paul being the bus driver. So someone in the group, one of the participants, is actually going to act as Paul, and other participants are going to act as the passengers. And we try out these various ways that Paul might respond to his passengers. And so that's a central piece of our group is, I guess, a piece of drama, which is around acting out this metaphor physically in the room if we're doing a group in person, and making it much more concrete, moving around the room, drawing a little steering wheel on a piece of paper, people acting as the value, this sort of thing. And so, uh, and trying out willingness, but also trying out being hijacked, trying out struggling or fighting with the passengers. So it looks somewhat like this. This is me a few years ago training some health professionals in how to run these groups. And the person who's turning back to the people on the right hand side there is responding to her passengers there. That's what it looks like. So there's a point in the group where we're getting up and we're trying this stuff out. It isn't all just about suggesting that your passengers are something to struggle with or not have. There are, of course, helpful passengers on our buses. Memories, thoughts, voices, suspicions that might be watching out for us, right? So the idea is a more sophisticated one about the experiences of psychosis, of looking at the functions of these experiences and how they work for the person. So, again, our idea is not to get rid of or reduce psychosis. Our idea is to strengthen the person who's the driver, to strengthen their personal recovery. And they can decide what they want to do with their experiences. So, to wrap things up, here's what we've discovered so far in the United Kingdom and in Australia. Group Act for Psychosis, at least the 7 session version of it that we do, is feasible, right? If you have the resources of people running this, if you've got a place to run it, if you've got a degree of safety in your services to do it, you've got support from your services to do it, then you can run these groups. And people with psychosis so far are saying, this is, yeah, I'll come to this. Yeah, I like this. I like you guys are that, respectful about it. People, we get feedback like, some of these facilitators, I think they're referring to me, you guys are more messed up than I am, when they actually hear about what we struggle with. Um, then we get, humorous, ironic sort of views like that. But people find the groups acceptable. And it seems from the research we're doing so far that the groups are showing that they may be effective, that we do see improvements in people's well-being and their quality of life and their sense of making progress in personal recovery. It may be also that people's relationship with health services changes so that they're less crisis driven. But the story doesn't just end here. There's a need for more work, more development across countries and cultures with, and to do larger, more rigorous studies, but just to understand better how we can support people in their personal recovery from psychosis. Seems to me so far, ACT shows promise for that. But I hope, to learn from the work that you may be doing in Poland about what you discover in doing this too. So thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's wonderful just to listen to you about working with psychosis and in a group, which is also, I guess, much more efficient way, but also enabling people to form some relationships, get some social interaction. So that's
Yes.
perfect. And we are arriving at a time where questions can be asked. You can either ask through microphone or maybe write them down in the chat if you wish. Does anyone have a question? Magda, yes. Uh,
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I would like to congratulate you or maybe appreciate the work that you're doing. And I'm really inspired by the impact that you are making. So many places that are trying to use the method. It's very inspiring to form social connections, also in a form of different places
Mm.
to use it. So it's great. And I would like to say that I recently became a huge fan of group therapy, and it's kind of my experience from my training. And I'm not experienced in ACT group therapy, so I have two questions about this. And first of all, the first question is you said that the group therapy it could be something like try before you buy, like demo version, where
Yes.
the individual therapy could be like probably some kind of full version or premium version. And I would like to ask about your view on that. I don't know if there are research comparing individual or group therapy in psychosis, but Bartosz also mentioned some, I would say, probably additional benefits of group therapy. So
Yes.
what's your
Yeah.
take on that? So
Yeah.
that's my
Yeah. No.
first.
And the way I appreciate this question uh and the way I'm taking your question is also like, yeah, perhaps I shouldn't suggest that group therapy is sort of like a lesser version of therapy. Um, because yeah, my lived experience is, oh man. stuff's happening there that's, of course, just as important as consequential as individual therapy. So I'm with you there. I think the way we pitched or developed the groups was Joe Oliver and I had a problem 18 years ago, which was no one would come and see us for individual therapy, right? And we were supposed to be helping people. And so we just had to find another way of engaging young people with psychosis in something that didn't look like you were visiting your teacher or, that had a sort of fun or a lightness to it, as much as a psychological group can, right? Um, that maybe involved your peers more. And so this seemed like if you were to build services from the ground up, maybe you wouldn't do individual therapy. Maybe you'd do like lots of groups. You'd build social connections. These days I'm like, oh, that's a really important piece. So yeah, for some people, a lot of people we helped, the group therapy was their therapy. And I bet they've learned a lot from the other participants in the therapy rather than the therapists. That's been a really important part of it. For some people we helped, it did seem to um, give them a positive experience so that they then would try individual therapy if they needed it, right? And the difference to me is group therapy is sort of like a scattershot approach. We're not doing anything that's individualized or uses a formulation. That doesn't mean it's less than, it's just a different experience. So we also have people in our groups here in Melbourne who don't make it to the last couple of sessions because they got a job or they've actually their lives have improved, or whatever. That's a nice little anecdote, but it happens often enough that things have improved for people that they might send a message to another participant in the group saying, "I'm sorry, I can't make it to the last few sessions. I actually was able to get a job or do these things that I wanted to do and this sort of thing." And so I think, like you said, Bartosz, it may be an efficient way of helping people. Um, Although, it involves two, three workers, it involves us spending, a big block of time. It involves the service sort of supporting it, but reaching a good number of people, this is an excellent way of doing it. So, yeah. And, we're still to understand what all these processes are that happen when a group of people meet together and share about their experiences. The other thing that comes to mind that I didn't mention earlier that I don't know whether this will answer any of your questions as well, but the thing is we actually in the groups very rarely talk about psychosis itself. We don't avoid it. It's just that if you start a conversation about what you care about in life, then many people will talk about that, right? And someone might say, "Oh, my voice gets in the way," and this sort of thing. But the groups are not about psychotic symptoms. They're about living well. It just so happens that just about everyone in the group is someone who's experienced psychosis. Um, and that seems to create a safe enough place that you may mention it, you may not, you know. So, yeah, in 18 years, I've become a fan of groups. And I perhaps didn't necessarily come with the training of thinking of groups first as the way of supporting people.
Yeah, thanks. And I think the second question is connected also with what are you saying now. And my observation is that the program of the group therapies is, of course, it has to be efficient. It has to be in public mental health. It has to be efficient, quick. It has to give results. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking about because I'm seeing that the program uh, is centered around education and experience. So there are
Mm.
two aspects.
That's
And
right.
also, for example, when you were speaking about the Paul story, you told that first we are starting with someone else's story, then
Hmm.
we can go to individual stories. And
Yes.
one of the aspects that I found very helpful in group therapy, but I don't have any experience in psychosis groups, is to just have this free space for participants in the context of whole group to share their stories and to train train these abilities on the go. And I
Yes.
was wondering if you were thinking about something like that, if it happens in the groups,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
is it like?
Yes. So originally our groups were 4 sessions in South London because we didn't think people would come to more than that, right? And we discovered they wanted more than 4 sessions. So this is like a belief we had that was tested, right? And we went to 6, again, with that idea of efficiency in the health service. And the feedback we've had from participants is 6 to 7 sessions for what we do is probably enough. We do have people who come back multiple times to multiple groups, so we've had people who've come 2, 3, 4 times to groups. So that's something. Um, but we've also had colleagues we have colleagues in New Zealand who've done this version of the group over a much longer period, or they've done an open group, right? So where um, they might do like what we do of 6 sessions, and then they just extend it. So it's a drop in, practice your skills, connect type thing um, each week. And that works too. Um, the thing in our groups is early on, people don't share very much. So, one of the things we joke about is that you will ask people their experiences and you'll get crickets, it'll be like a gust of nothing is said. And that if you're used to being a facilitator of a group where there's lots of talking, that's not what happens early on, right? And so this having Paul's story as a way of kindling conversation, that's what we're doing, right? And then sometimes, hey, now we're on. People are willing to share about this stuff. Um, our groups are very skills focused, so there isn't a lot of open-ended time for sharing and discussion. We are really focusing on the skills of ACT, and in part because we've had lots of people in our groups who've never done a group before. You know, um, we've we've had the sense that we want to scaffold a sense of safety that what's going to happen in the group, and, at some point, Eric or another facilitator will guide us into another activity. There won't just be this open-ended silence the whole time, right? Um, so our groups are of a particular kind. They're about skills. They're about sort of trying to get you moving. But other colleagues have certainly taken this and gone much further with it. And that's been super interesting to see people recovering from psychosis have a regular place every week where they've had this shared experience of this and they're pursuing their values. And, you've got somewhere where you can go and be with people who you don't have to explain yourself. They get you. I mean, we all could benefit from that. And and that's been some of the exciting things to see from other colleagues about the kinds of work they've then done with this model in a much longer sense. I
Great,
hope
thank
that
you.
helps. Yeah. Great questions. Thank you.
So, um, I have a question. So,
Hmm.
there is a paper on facilitating deictic distinction in addition to deictic coordination as a part
Hmm.
of creating healthy self with individuals who are hearing voices.
Yeah.
I wonder what is your relationship with that idea? Also, regarding the do less I and you are different part in the
Yeah.
therapeutic relationship and the context of group ACT P.
Yeah. Yeah. So we um so it's a great question, Bartos, that's on my mind because we are about to embark in some research here in Melbourne around, let's call it selfing. Dialectic relating, right? And looking at it as a common process across psychological therapies for psychosis. Um, in our groups, we talk about open, aware, and active, but we are curious that there is a process of, authoring your own life, of creating a bit of a distinction between you and your experiences. And we are definitely in the groups um, strengthening a hierarchical way of responding to your own experiences, right? Um, so, the passengers on the bus metaphor has potentially that function in it to strengthen for people. Um, the group involves diffusion exercises and noticing exercises that are about building that. But I, I and other people here are curious about how we could further use some of that knowledge from relational frame theory um, to think of exercises and ways to further strengthen flexible self processes. Um, because they're evident in psychological therapies of psychosis. In other therapies, people do things like, you know, empty chair work, you know, they do things like compassion and flows of compassion. The passenger of the bus has this in it. Um, they do things like, reauthoring parts of your life, but really focusing on you being the person who can author things. So, yeah, I we think that it's a component there that's particularly for psychosis, which seems to, if I can say it this way this morning, attacks your sense of self, can make your sense of self so blurry and disconnected that there's probably some work there for us to use this model in a more precise way to test whether we can strengthen flexible selfing. At least that's the way I'm thinking about it at the moment. And we're hoping from our lab and from a collaboration with Lynn Ellett and Jess Kingston in the United Kingdom that we might be able to do some experimental studies to see whether we can develop some more precise interventions in that space that you've asked about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think we might have time for one more question.
I have one, if I can.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, I found this very curious. One of my questions was already asked by Bartek, because I'm really wondering. I'm leading now the project for trauma-informed care for
Mhm,
non-formal educators here in Europe,
mhm.
and our one of our goals is to facilitate, um, you know, it's not really this word, but okay, let's go to taking care of the early psychosis in teenagers, and using the facilitators to be able to see what's happening, no, and not labeling this
Yes.
kid into okay, no, he is, for example, a troublemaker or just asking
Yeah.
what's going on, no, for example.
Mm.
Um, but I wonder how, if you believe that peer support specialists, individuals with a lived experience of psychotic crisis, should play a central role in group intervention for psychosis recovery, or
Yeah.
it can be also um, people just if it's if we have this so we are, for example, in Poland we have this open dialogue association, no, that they are of course training facilitators of the assistant of the recovery,
Yeah.
but they are not only people with psychosis experience.
Yes.
So, and I'm just was wondering what advantage and challenges do you see in this approach compared to groups led solely by mental health professionals? And
Hmm.
what do you think about how to, make this approach with this open dialogue of
Yeah.
the recovery assistance?
Yeah. Well, okay. So So one thing I've noticed with training health professionals to run these groups is now it might be different in Poland, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in Australia, some of what you have to do is kind of retrain professionals to not be so pathologizing in
Yes.
their responses and language,
Mhm.
right? And the
Thank you.
advantage, yeah, the advantages of peers is they might not have that history of behaving those ways towards people. So sometimes I sort of think, and this is me being enthusiastic this morning. I'd much rather have a group run by peers than health professionals on average, because health professionals are sort of kind of got to get out of their own way in being human beings sometimes with people, right? I think when you have a group like ACT, you are, of course, wanting the facilitators to do it with a degree of fidelity, right? So it does involve training and supporting people to respond in ways consistent with the model. And that can be uh, a good fit for some peer facilitators and not such a fit, right? Um, it's also with our groups that while we do some self-disclosure, we're actually very disciplined in it. And so it's also the case with a peer that it isn't that they're telling their whole story of recovery, so there is a way our groups are. I think about the open dialogue um, if I put it that way, is I think it is nicely challenging to people who've been traditionally trained as health professionals because I think it's contextual. I think it's like ACT should also be contextual. Like, let's
Yeah.
situate people's distress in an interaction with their environments, their social environments, not in them, right? And that to me has been the problem with the way that, well, uh, the Western European tradition of thinking about psychosis as something inside you, that, it's a particular broken individual instead of what's wrong with our communities, what's going on in our families, what's happening in our relationships that is so maddening for some people. And I'm not denying there are biological um, vulnerabilities that people have, but there's also an awful lot of social and psychologically risky places and histories to have.
Mhm.
And so, um, if I try and tie up my answer to what you were asking earlier about young people, I think about the worst thing you can do with a young person is react in a very, frightened, scared, alarmed way about them having unusual experiences. I'm not saying be laissez-faire completely about things that are troubling people, but we also know that what might tip people towards psychosis is very catastrophic ideas about what's going on with them,
Mhm.
you know? And so what I love about open dialogue is it just situates the challenges somewhere else and it distributes the responsibility um, to what you hope, nurturing environments. And to me, as a contextualist of an act form, oh, I can totally dig that. Yes, I think that is more probably what is going to support recovery than some of the ideas we have that are disordered and diseased or suggest people are broken in some way. But anyway, you can see I'm warming up this morning. That's a great,
Thank you so much, really. That was very helpful.
good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your lecture, for your interaction, for the overtime. So,
Oh, well, yes.
yeah,
I'm mindful it might be overtime for you, and I'm sorry if I ate into what
so
you have else on today, but um, I'm very appreciative for the invitation to share this work with you. Thank you.
thank you very much.
All right.